Welcome again to Authors at Google. Welcome to the parents who are here for Take Your Parents to Work Day. We are excited to have Brandon Sanderson here today. He has written quite a lot of books and has a lot in the works, according to Wikipedia, which is where I got my info for this bio. And it tells me he is best known for his Mistborn series and his work finishing Robert Jordan's epic fantasy series, The Wheel of Time, which, at least for me, is The Wheel of Time is how I was introduced to his works, and am glad that I was, because have loved the Mistborn books as well as his new Reckoner series, and can't wait to read even more. I think that's about all I'm going to do for you. Short and sweet. So please join me in welcoming Brandon Sanderson.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Google. This is actually my fourth Google campus. I'm trying to visit them all, I guess. It's like Pokemon. What's that? I get a badge for that? Yeah. So what we're going to do today is I'm actually going to talk at you, just a little speech for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then we will do a short Q&A. And then I'm going to do a reading that takes another 15, 20 minutes to wrap off our whole hour here, all right? And my speeches, when I first went on tour, I started talking a lot about my books at the speeches. But then I started to realize that everyone who was at my signings already had the book I was talking about. So I didn't really need to do a hard sell. So instead, I started thinking about, they give me this platform. I'm a university professor. You give me a microphone and a platform, I'll start talking about stuff. I started kind of just talking a little bit about whatever I was thinking about at the time. And it does usually relate a little bit to my writing in some way. But it's just whatever's been inside my head. People like to reach in there and be like, ooh, this is what the author's thinking about. And my story actually this time starts in Sharjah. Does anyone know where Sharjah is? Smart people in this room. I thought you guys did. I had no idea where Sharjah was when they wrote me and said, hey, would you like to come to our book festival? Turns out Sharjah is one of the United Arab Emirates. So you've heard of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, most likely. Sharjah is next door to them. I get invitations to book festivals quite a lot. And I got this one and said, free trip? Sure. I mean, I've never been to the Middle East before, and the United Arab Emirates right there on the Arabian Peninsula, right next to Saudi Arabia. I thought, this will be super cool. I don't know if anyone there reads my books. Often, you get invitations to these festivals just because they're looking and saying, who is someone we haven't had yet? Him. But it sounded like it was a fun time, and I said yes. And indeed, over there, if you get a chance, the United Arab Emirate is awesome. I got to go out and see the sand dunes, right? These enormous, we flew in a helicopter for 45 minutes over them. They're just endless, right? Over to the Arabian border, and I took lots of pictures of myself on top of giant sand dunes making Arrakis jokes, right? You can tell I'm a nerd. It's not Lawrence of Arabia. It's like walk without rhythm, guys. Sandworms will eat ya. But then it came time to go to my signing. And I was a little apprehensive because you never, you go to a signing, you're never sure if anyone's going to show up. And you go to a signing in a foreign country, you're extra uncertain what it's going to be like, what the expectations are. And I walk into the big hall where they're having the signings, and there's this big line of people, and they're wearing traditional Emirati clothing, which means for the women, they wear the hijab, which is the headscarf that leaves the face open, the black one, and they're wearing the black dress. And then the men are wearing the thob, which is the white garment, and then they have their own headdress, and it looks all very formal and kind of intimidating. And yet they're all holding huge stacks of Brandon Sanderson novels. Just big stacks. And you guys have, I feel so bad for people. They come to my signings. My books kind of are big. And so they're like lugging them along. But I stop and I look at this big line of people and I think, it's my people, right? I've come home. I've traveled across the world to a completely different culture, and I've found the science fiction nerds. And it was really this wonderful moment where I thought about the power of storytelling and fiction to connect people. Here I had somehow made a connection with people in a very different culture from my own, writing these stories. And I sat in the line, we got to talk about our favorite Star Trek captains. There was one woman there who had just gotten back from Comic-Con in Dubai. And it was really cool. You guys, she did a cosplay. She dressed as the character No Face from the Miyazaki film, which is this character who's all black with a white face mask. She just put a face mask on. She's like, I did it. It was so easy. It was an amazing, amazing moment just thinking about that, like I said, that power of fiction. Like I can read a book written 3,000 years ago by someone on a different continent, and I can feel the same emotions they were feeling when they wrote that story. And that is absolutely amazing. And so this led me, as is natural, to thinking about King Sejong the Great, right? Just like that's where you guys went, right? King Sejong. King Sejong is one of my favorite people in history. He was king of Korea in the 1400s. Sejong, when he rose to power, he had this really interesting problem he wanted to solve. And he did this kind of in secret. He gathered a bunch of scholars together. Very secret, very hush-hush. It was like Mission Impossible with Confucian, scholar kings. And he gets his scholars together and he says, I want to come up with a writing system for my people. Now, the thing is, back then, and still commonly in Asia, but back then you wrote Korean using Chinese characters. Does anyone here speak Chinese? A few of you. So I apologize for what I'm about to do to Chinese. I don't know simplified, I only know complex, and I'm not very good at it. But Chinese is this really cool writing system because Chinese is what we call logographic. At least it's mostly logographic. That means that each Chinese character represents an idea rather than being something phonetic that you can sound out. And this pen is not working terribly well, but it's okay. And there's not supposed to be one of those. This one's better? Okay. I'll let you take that one. And so if you want to write, oh, that is way better. If you want to write, for instance, Korea, you have to write it like this. That's Korea in Chinese characters, written very poorly. Now, the great thing about this is you can, whatever your language is, you can read this in your language if you know the characters. So if you show this to someone in Japan, they'll be like, oh, that means Korea. If you show it to someone in China, if you show it to someone in Korea, someone in Thailand, someone in Mongolia, it crosses cultural boundaries really well because, the characters just represent an idea. But the big problem with Chinese is that you can't sound it out, which means that for King Sejong's people, who were mostly farmers, not scholars, memorizing thousands of these things to be able to read was very tough. So his people were completely illiterate. And beyond that, this doesn't, you can write Chinese really well in this, obviously, but writing Korean is difficult because Korean has different conjugation and structure than Chinese. And so it's like, how do you write the Korean conjugation? You just can't. You can't write Korean possessives. Korean, when you write it out, you write your whatever your subject is, you put a little marker on it to say this is our subject. It's called, you write like nun or e. You can't write that with the Chinese. You either have to kind of write in caveman speak, or you have to add in all these characters that don't actually mean what they say they mean, and it gets really confusing. And so King Sejong said, I want to solve this. We're going to come up with a way to write Korean that works with the Chinese. And they came up with something really ingenious. It's called Hangul. And Hangul is this thing where you create a phonetic version of a Chinese character. This is an H-A-N-K-U-K, Hangul, Korea. And you put these together in these kind of these syllable blocks where you construct something that would work in the same writing system with the Chinese, which is really nifty because what you can do is you can still write in Chinese and then add the Korean letters to give the conjugation if you want to. Or you can just write straight in Korean and write it exactly the same way. Or you can drop in the occasional cool Chinese character to look awesome, which is what people do these days. Like, if you want to be cool, you write some words in Chinese, you're like, yeah, and then the rest is all in Korean because Chinese it kind of just looks beautiful on the page. So King Sejong came up with this. It is amazing how well this works. In fact, Korea is one of the most literate countries in the world today, partially because of how great this writing system is. Linguists just drool over this writing system. It is so nifty. There's lots of really cool things about it. But he presents it to his court after they come up with it. and they hated it. They absolutely hated it. In fact, one of the people in court wrote, "How could this not be a setback to our civilization? Spending too much thought and effort on this is a waste of time, detrimental to the timely pursuit of scholarship." Yeah. So this cool system that is brilliant, and since then it's been widely regarded as one of the best alphabets ever invented. One of the only major, in fact, I think the only major alphabet that was designed by scholars rather than arising accidentally. So why did they hate it? Any guesses?
Made scholarship more accessible.
It made scholarship more accessible. That's exactly what it was. At this time, if you know anything about Confucian society, taking the tests in Chinese to prove how great you are at Chinese is what got you a place in the government, which is the best jobs. It was a mark of nobility. And the idea that the common people could read was really a big deal to the Koreans. And it completely caused this huge revolution. There's these stories, by the way, of like Ki Sejong like writing Hangul on leaves and spreading them through the air to the people. People see it and be like, oh, immediately recognize that this is brilliant and start being able to write it because they found it on the leaves. But years later, one of the kings tried to forbid this because of this reason, to keep the people from reading. And by then, in just a few generations, it became so pervasive in the culture that he couldn't stamp it out, no matter how hard he tried. This stuff is awesome. And yet, people tried to keep everyone else from reading. And this is actually a theme. This is a pretty big theme through history. The people who tried to first translate the Bible into English didn't go so well for them. I don't know if you know that, but they got burned at the stake. And the resistance to literacy programs in the 1800s and early 1900s is shocking to us nowadays, where you're like, why would anyone not want other people to read? Well, it's a theme. It's something, for some reason, the people who know something often want to keep everyone else from figuring it out. Now, you might be saying, okay, Brandon, we're here at a book signing. We work for Google. We're good on this literacy thing. We promise to teach people to read. You're preaching to the choir. There's an issue relating to this that has really started bothering me over the last few years. And I think we're doing something very similar to what these scholars are doing inside of the science fiction fantasy reading community. Let me read you a quote from a blogger named Bonnie Burton. She says, "As a geek girl, I've been accused of wearing a Star Wars shirt to get attention from guys. I've been told to move aside and let real gamers play the demos at conventions. Lately, it seems elements of the geek community have become a lot less a welcome wagon and more a judgmental Jedi council that refuses to let newbies in, especially if they happen to be girls. In a community once known for celebrating outcasts and underdogs, it sometimes now seems like you have to take some sort of Voight-Kampff test to prove your geekdom is legit." And if you didn't get that reference, that is a Blade Runner reference. She's totally proving her geekdom is legit with that one. But there's this sense that you have to prove that you are a true fan to become part of our community, right? And this is bigger than the video game community. It's bigger than it's this idea that, like, with how popular, for instance, the comic book movies have become, I found myself saying, you guys are not true Iron Man fans. Or my big one was the Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? I read Eastman and Laird, original run of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when they all had red masks, right? This is the way it's supposed to be. And when it got popular, I'm like, you guys do not know the Turtles. You are not fans of my Turtles. How dare you, right? How many here, because I've done it, I'll raise my hand. How many here have made fun of Twilight? Yeah. Or Aragon, or The Hunger Games, or whatever popular fiction seems to be bringing people into the science fiction and fantasy community at the time. For some reason, those of us entrenched inside of it get really resistant. I remember when I was at science fiction conventions in the late 90s, early 2000s, and people referred to J.K. Rowling as that damn Scottish woman. Because suddenly, all these people inside the community had this club. And suddenly it was everyone. Now, it's hard to imagine that now because J.K. Rowling went on to win a Hugo Award. She's been very accepted by the community. And yet, initially, when something takes off and gets popular, the community wants to push back against it. And I found myself doing this. Now, I want to take an aside and say I'm not saying we can't criticize. In fact, I think we should. I have an English degree. It's kind of 4 years of learning to criticize stuff, right? It's important to say, I don't like this, and this is why, to kind of just start that discourse, to have a discussion. But what I'm talking about people are doing is less about the criticism and more about the shaming, right? It's the kid who gets on the forums excited because he's read Aragon, and it's like he's discovered something that changed his life, and he goes and he posts, I love the fantasy books, I just read Aragon, can we talk about this? And the responses you can see, like 50 responses in a row of, why don't you read something real? You idiot, this is dumb, that's just a copy of Star Wars, or whatever. Just all the way down the list. That's what I'm talking about. It's particularly bad on the internet. It's become worse and worse over the last decade because of just how we are treating one another. And that hurts me because fiction is about connecting, right? I spent several years in higher education getting a master's degree in creative writing, and I had to fight every day to convince them that science fiction was legit, right? I had professors who refused to give me good grades because I was writing fantasy novels and turning them in. And so to have been fighting all that and to see our community doing it to the people who are trying to get in and be part of it really bothers me. So this is my plea and my request. Can we be a little less acerbic? Can we be a little less hateful, a little less critical? Can we talk about what we like and don't like without dragging the people who like what we don't into the discussion, right? Can we keep it about the fiction and less about the people who love it? And next time you run into something that you're like, I just don't like this, maybe instead of your first instinct being going to go online and say, everyone who likes this is stupid, maybe give it another read. Maybe read through something you wouldn't have before, and you don't have to like it, but read through it with the intent of figuring out why other people love it. And if you can figure that out, if you can do that, then the fiction is still fulfilling its purpose. It's doing what I did when I went to Sharjah. I was able to connect with people. You can connect with people who are different than yourselves, who like things different than you do. And if you can figure out why they love something, I think you'll understand them a little bit better. So thank you very much. So let's go ahead and do a short Q&A. Anything you guys are interested in asking me, go ahead, and I'll just repeat the questions. That'll be easier for the camera and things like that. So whatever you want to know, I'll answer them, and then we'll do the reading. Any questions? Oh, no questions. Okay, right here.
You're known to be a very prolific writer. What do you attribute your productivity to?
So I'm known to be a very prolific writer. To what do I attribute my productivity? I can liken this unto Google. I remember the first time I visited Google. It was the Seattle campus. And I got there, and they had valet parking for the engineers. And I'm like, valet parking for the engineers? What's going on? They're like, well, it might take them a little too long to find a space because it's kind of tight here. We want them to just get in and start working. And then I go in, and they have like this full-service cafeteria that's serving this amazing food. I'm like, this is all free? And they're like, yeah. And then there's like massage tables, there's candy, and and I realized all they wanted to do was keep you there working and make you forget what time it was. So it's like midnight, and you're like, oh, I've just been enjoying myself so much. Or, one of the people joked that's like they start dinner at a certain time, so if you get done working, you're like, oh, if I just wait another hour or two, dinner's here, right? And then and it's all kind of designed around this idea of keeping you happy and working. That's my life, right? I love my job, and I work from home for most of the time, which means that I actually have plenty of time with my family because I get done. I work from about noon until 5. I get done. I play with my kids, my family, from about 5:30 to about 8:30, 9. And then I go back to work, and I work from 9 or 10 until 3 or 4. And I enjoy my job, and I don't have a commute, right? I'm just there. It's like I could go do something else, or I could do what I love. And what I love usually wins. So I don't consider I'm not that fast a writer, but what I am is I'm a consistent writer, and I'm very passionate about what I do, and so I produce around 2,000 words a day, basically every day. And that just adds up. So, yeah. All right, other questions right here.
How much of your writing do you plot out in advance? And how much
Good question. How much do I plot out in advance and how much unfolds? So most writers fall somewhere on a spectrum between what we call discovery writers and outline writers. George R. R. Martin has great terms for these. He calls them gardeners and architects. And I am much more an architect. I would say I'm about 70-30 on the architect side. The 30%, so what I do is I build an outline. I actually build it in reverse. I start with what I want to have happen, and then I work backward. And this is actually, it's not like heading A, subheading B. It's not like that. What I do is I think, all right, I've got these two characters. What's their relationship going to be? How are they going to interact? All right, what's the end goal? What do I want the moment between them at the end to be? You can be they don't like each other. It can be they like each other, whatever. I will then brainstorm steps along the way as a list of bullet points. And I'll do that for every subplot. My mystery, how does the magic work? A training, a character becoming better at something. Any sort of, we need to figure this out. And, the main one's usually whatever the big plot of the book is, but all the subplots. And so I have all of these goals and bullet points. And that becomes my outline. When I work forward, I'm grabbing these bullet points and kind of weaving them in as I go so that I make sure I'm getting all the proper foreshadowing for the different subplots. I do a lot of planning on my world building ahead of time, a ton of that. World building is very important to me. I want, one of the things I've tried to bring to fantasy is I would like to have a little bit of the science fiction rigor for fantasy worlds, which is not something that as a reader I found a lot of. And so it felt like a hole in the genre that I wanted to fill. My characters, I do not do a lot of planning. I figure out who they are, but usually I do that by writing some scenes through their viewpoint and try to explore who they are. And then I'm like, all right, I got a feel for who this person is. Let's build a plot for them. But it's very vague and very loose, and that kind of trumps all the other stuff. If I'm writing this character along and they're not who they're becoming would not fulfill the plot that is planned for them, then I have to go rebuild my outline, or I have to tear the character out and put a new character in that place. So I've done both, depending on the situation. And so it's this organic thing. And I do that very intentionally because outline writers tend to have a problem that their endings are explosive, but their characters are weak. And discovery writers tend to have weak endings and great characters. And if you kind of take that as a guide, you can usually figure out who is who in writing, right? You usually can. You can figure out if they're more an outline writer or more discovery writer. And where books really start to take off, I feel, is where you can hybridize the two, and you can kind of use the discovery writing for the characters and the outlining for the plot. And when you can get those two working really well, that's where I think books really start to come together for me. So there you are. Let's go right here.
So sort of a related question, but on the level, like you have this universe connecting a lot of your books.
Yes.
So to what extent do you sort of have that built out in your head?
Excellent. So I have something called the Cosmere, which is, if you're unfamiliar, my epic fantasies are all connected in very subtle, minor ways. They're cameos from different characters in each one. So any of my books that don't mention Earth tend to be in the Cosmere. That's how you can rule of thumb what is and what isn't. And I'm weaving a few characters with a kind of a hidden epic behind the scenes that I'll eventually get to. Right now, it's all just Easter eggs. But because I'm planning all of this, I have to have a really solid outline for the entire Cosmere, which is, when I originally plotted, it was between 32 and 36 books, depending on which books got split and things like that. And yes, I have a pretty solid outline for all of that. The fortunate aspect of that is that remember that it's all Easter eggs for right now. So you can read the series out of order. It doesn't matter. You're not missing anything. You just have to watch for some of these characters that are popping in and out. And eventually you'll find more and more what they're doing. That does require a lot of plotting. And it's something I did because some of my favorite writers connected some of their worlds late in life, and I thought it was brilliant, but it also was obvious they didn't do it from the beginning, right? Isaac Asimov wove together the robots and Foundation in a really clever way, but it wasn't there from the get-go. He just figured it out later on, which is kind of what you have to do when you start writing in, the 30s, and you weave them together in, the 70s or something like that. But that kind of inspired me. I'm like, he's done that. Stephen King did the thing where he kind of tied them all together with the Dark Tower and stuff like this. Can I do something from the get-go that plans this? And so from Elantris, my first book, which was sold in 2003, I have all of these kind of things seeded, with the idea being that there is an overarching plot for the whole thing. So it is coming, but there's a lot of it's a ways off. The Mistborn books are forming kind of a core for that, which is, yeah, I should actually talk about my book, shouldn't I? When I originally pitched Mistborn to my editor, I said, I want to do something I haven't seen in fantasy. It's kind of one of my guiding principles. Have I seen it done in fantasy? Let's see if we can do it. I want to do a fantasy world that evolved into a modern day world, that eventually evolved into a science fiction world. And the magic becomes the means by which space travel is possible, right? And so I wrote this epic fantasy trilogy, and then I jumped forward and I'm kind of doing 1910s era to kind of show how the fantasy books became the foundation of mythology and history for a modern take. And then I'm going contemporary-ish next. I'm really probably gonna go 1980s, kind of Tom Clancy-esque spy epics. But you guys will like that one. The main character in that, she's a programmer in a very early programming language on Scadrial. So she gets yeah. So imagine a programmer who gets recruited by the CIA to go be a field agent. It'll make sense when I do it. But we will eventually evolve that into a science fiction space epic. So that's where I'm going with those. And I should have mentioned when I did this was actually the inspiration for Elantris. This idea of the Chinese characters and Korean, because I speak Korean, and learning this was really cool. And that's why my very first published book, Elantris, has this magic system based around these cool characters and the language surrounding them. So let's go do like one more question right here. Yes. And
how do you feel about movie adaptations of your books? Would you be open to them?
Would I be open to doing movie adaptations of my books? I would love to see movie adaptations done. I am a child of the 70s or of the 80s really, and I was born in 75. I grew up with Star Wars. I grew up with all this stuff, right? I am, science fiction cinematic history is a big part of what made me into a writer. And so, yes. Now, I understand that sometimes they screw it up. And I say they as a nebulous they. Usually when films go wrong, it's not because someone is trying to make a bad film. It just doesn't come together. But I would rather roll the dice on a good film and risk having a bad film. That's something that I would very much like to do. So I have sold the rights to several of my series. Mistborn is owned by one company. The Reckoners is owned by Fox, and with Sean Levy's production company. He's the one who did the Night at the Museum films, and a film called Real Steel, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. It's a great film. Wolverine with fighting robots. And then The Emperor's Soul is owned by DMG Entertainment. So I've sold a lot of these, and I'm working with them. They've all been very easy to work with, but nothing is gotten a green light yet. So, until something gets a green light, it means it's just in production, and it could be there for the next 20 years. So, so don't hold your breath. 1 in 30 of these is the statistic I keep hearing that get made, but I'm very hopeful. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and stop now and go ahead and go into the reading. Now, this reading is actually going to be from the 3rd Stormlight book. But I am reading a flashback sequence for a character named Dalinar, which means if you haven't read the other Stormlight books, it's not a spoiler because it takes place 30 years before the first book begins. It may change your perception of this character when we get to him. But so I'm going to do this reading. It's about 20 minutes long. It is, this doesn't matter to you, but for parents who might be watching, this is a little bit on the violent side. I mean, it's Dalinar at war, so yeah. Yeah, well, we're recording this. They're going to put it up, so I wanted to put that little warning there. That's why I said for parents who might be watching this, not for I'm talking to the video camera for that one, not you guys. I understand you can handle PG-13, but all right. Rock buds crunched like skulls beneath Dalinar's boots as he charged across the burning field. His elites tromped behind him, a hand-picked force of soldiers, both light-eyed and dark. They weren't an honor guard. Dalinar didn't need guards. These were simply the men he considered competent enough not to embarrass him. Around him, rockbuds smoldered. Moss, dried from the summer heat and long days between storms this time of year, flared up in waves, setting the rockbud shells themselves aflame. Dalinar charged through the smoke, trusting in his padded armor and thick boots to protect him. Flamespren, like tiny people made of fire, danced from one patch of flame to the next. The enemy, pressed by his armies from the north, had pulled back into this town just ahead. Dalinar had held himself back with difficulty from entering that initial clash. He'd known the real fighting would take place here, in the town. He hadn't expected the enemy to, in a desperate move, fire this plain, burning their own crops to block the southern approach. Well, no matter. The fires could go to damnation for all Dalinar cared. He led his men in a charge, and though some were overwhelmed by the smoke or heat, most stayed with him. They'd crash into the enemy from the south, pressing them between his men here and the main army. Hammer and anvil, the best kind of tactic, the type that didn't allow his enemies to get away from him. As Dalinar burst from the smoky air, he found a few lines of spearmen hastily making ranks on the southern edge of the town. There were remnants of a wall, but that had been torn down years ago. Dalinar had forgotten the town's name, but the location was ideal. A large ridge to the east made a natural break from the storms and had allowed this place to sprawl almost like a real city. Dalinar screamed at the enemy soldiers, beating his sword, just a regular longsword, against his shield. He wore a sturdy breastplate and helm along with iron-lined boots. The spearmen ahead of him wavered as his elites roared from the smoke and flame, shouting a bloodthirsty cacophony. A few of the spearmen dropped weapons and ran. Fiercepren, like globs of violet goo, wriggled up from the ground in mass around the enemy rank. Dalinar grinned. He didn't need shards to intimidate. He hit the swordsman like a boulder, or the spearman like a boulder rolling through a grove of saplings, swinging his sword and sending limbs into the air. A good fight was about momentum. Don't stop, don't think. Drive forward and convince your enemies that they were as good as dead already. That way they'd fight you less as you sent them to their pyres. As he waited among them, the spearmen thrust weapons frantically toward him, less trying to kill Dalinar and more trying to push away this madman. Their ranks collapsed, and many of them turned their sides to Dalinar's elites. Dalinar laughed, slamming aside a pair of spears with a shield, then disemboweling one man with a sword deep in the gut. He jumped and left the man to drop his spear in a panic, trying to grab at his entrails. The man's allies backed away at the horrific sight, so Dalinar came in swinging, catching the two off balance, killing them with a sword that bore their friend's blood. Dalinar's elites decimated the now broken line. Dalinar himself pushed forward, keeping momentum, shearing through the ranks until he reached the back, breathing deeply and wiping ashen sweat from his face. A young spearman fell before him, crying, screaming for his mother as he crawled across the stony ground, trailing blood. Fiercepren mixed with painspren all around. Dalinar shook his head, picking up a fallen spear and striding past the youth, slamming it down in the boy's back. Men often cried for their parents as they died. Didn't matter how old they were. He'd seen graybeards do it, same as kids like this one. He's not much younger than I am, Dalinar thought. Maybe 17. But then Dalinar had never felt young, regardless of his age. His elites filled in behind him, having carved the enemy line in two. Dalinar danced, shaking off his bloodied blade, feeling alert, excited, but not yet alive. Where was it? Come on, he thought. A larger group of soldiers hiked down the street toward him, led by some officers in white and red. Dalinar could see from the way they pulled up, alarmed that they hadn't expected their spearmen to fall so quickly. Dalinar charged. His elites knew to watch, so he was followed by a force of 50 or 60. The rest had to finish off the unfortunate spearmen. Well, 50 would do. The crowded confines of the town would mean Dalinar shouldn't need more. As he neared this newer force, he focused his attention on the one man riding a horse. The fellow wore plate armor obviously meant to recreate shardplate, though it was only of common steel. It lacked the beauty, the power of true plate. He still looked like he was the most important person around. Hopefully that would mean he was the best. The man's honor guard rushed to engage, and Dalinar felt something stir inside of him, like a thirst, a physical need. Challenge. He needed a challenge, Stormit. He let his elites handle the honor guard. He made his way toward the Bright Lord. The man wasn't old enough to be the High Prince. Some other important light eyes? Or didn't Dalinar remember something about a son during Gavilar's endless planning meetings? Well, this man certainly looked grand on that white mare, watching the battle behind a helm face. The foe turned toward Dalinar and raised his sword to his helm in a sign of a challenge accepted. Idiot. Dalinar raised his shield arm and pointed, counting on at least one of his strikers to have lived and stayed with him. Indeed, Jenin stepped up, unhooked the short bow from his back, and, as the Bright Lord shouted his surprise, shot the horse in the chest. Hate shooting horses, Jenin grumbled as the beast reared in pain. Like throwing 1,000 bromes into the storming ocean, Bright Lord. I'll buy you 2 when we finish this, Dalinar said as the Bright Lord tumbled backward off his horse. Dalinar dodged around flashing hooves and snorts of pain, seeking out the fallen man. He was pleased to find the enemy rising. Dalinar came in swinging. The Bright Lord managed to get his sword up, and Dalinar battered it away, then dropped his own shield completely and came in with a 2-handed power swing, intending to knock the light-eyed soldier back down. Fortunately, the man was good enough to recover his stance and intercept the blow with his shield. They probably heard the subsequent crack all the way in Kholinar. Indeed, it vibrated up Dalinar's arms. Momentum. Life was about momentum. Pick a direction and don't let anything, man or storm, turn you aside. Dalinar battered at the Bright Lord, driving him backward, until, surprisingly, the man managed to pull a feint and get in close to ram Dalinar with his shield. Dalinar ducked the sword swing that followed, but the backhand hit him solidly on the side of the head, sending him stumbling. His helm twisted, metal bent by the blow biting into his scalp, drawing blood. He saw double, his vision swimming. He roared at the Lord as the Lord smartly came in for the kill. Dalinar swept his blade up in a lurching, full-shouldered blow, slapping the Lord's weapon out of his hands and tossing both swords away. The man, in turn, punched Dalinar in the face with his gauntlet, and Dalinar's nose crunched. Dalinar fell to his knees, vision blurry. His foe was breathing deeply, cursing between breaths, winded by the short, frantic contest. The Bright Lord fished at his belt for a knife. An emotion stirred inside of Dalinar, a fire that filled the pit within. It washed through him and awakened him, bringing clarity. The sounds of his elites fighting the Bright Lord's honor guard faded, metal on metal becoming distant clinks, grunts becoming like a humming. Dalinar grinned. Then that grin became a toothy smile. His vision returned as the Bright Lord, who had just retrieved his knife, looked up and started, stumbling back. He seemed horrified. Dalinar roared, spitting blood and throwing himself at the enemy. The swing that came for him seemed pitiful, and Dalinar ducked it, pushing his shoulder against his foe and shoving him backward. Something thrummed inside of Dalinar, the pulse of the battle, the rhythm of killing and dying. The thrill. He knocked his opponent off balance, then reached for his sword. Dim, however, hollered his name and tossed him a poleaxe with a hook on one side and broad, thin axe on the other. Dalinar seized it from the air and spun, ducking the Lord's swing. At the same time, he hooked the man around the ankle with the axe head and yanked. The Bright Lord fell in a clatter of steel. Unfortunately, before Dalinar could attack further, the honor guard became a bother. 2 had managed to extricate themselves from Dalinar's men, and they came to the defense of their lord. Dalinar caught their sword strikes on his polearm and twisted it about, backing away and bringing the axe head slamming into one man's side. Dalinar ripped it free and spun again, this time smashing the weapon against the rising lord's head and sending him to his knees. Then he came back and barely managed to catch the other guard's sword on the haft of his polearm. Dalinar pushed upward, holding the polearm in 2 hands, sweeping the guard's blade into the air over his head and stepping forward until he was face to face with the fellow. He could feel the man's breath on his face. Dalinar spit blood from his shattered nose into the guard's eyes, then kicked him in the stomach. He turned toward the Lord, who had scrambled again to his feet and who was now trying to flee. Dalinar growled, full of the thrill, and swung his polearm by one hand, hooking the spike in the Lord's side and yanking, dropping him a 3rd time. The Lord rolled, and this time he was greeted by the sight of Dalinar slamming his polearm down by 2 hands, driving the spike right through the breastplate and into the chest. It made a satisfying crunch, and Dalinar pulled it out, bloodied. The blow seemed a signal of sorts, and the honor guard and other soldiers finally broke before his elites. Dalinar grinned as he watched them go, glory spren popping up around him like glowing golden spheres. His men took out their short bows and managed to drop a good dozen of the fleeing enemy in the backs. Damnation. It felt good to best a force larger than his own. The thrill dwindled. He could never seem to hold on to it as long as he wanted. Nearby, the man he'd felled groaned softly. Dalinar stepped over, curious, kicking at the armored chest. "Why?" the man said from within his helm. "Why us?" "Don't know," Dalinar said, tossing the polearm back to Dim. You don't know?" "My brother chooses. I just go where he points me." He gestured toward the dying man, and Dim rammed his sword in the hole in the breastplate, finishing the job. The fellow had fought reasonably well, no need to extend his suffering. Another soldier approached, handing Dalinar his sword. It had a chip the size of a thumb right in the blade. Looked like it had bent as well. "You're supposed to stick it in the squishy parts, Bright Lord," Dim said. "Not pound it against the hard parts." "I'll keep that in mind," Dalinar said, tossing the sword aside as one of his men selected a replacement from among the fallen of high enough rank to have one. "You all right, Bright Lord?" "Never been better," Dalinar said, then sucked blood up through his broken nose. Hurt like damnation itself. His men formed around him, and Dalinar led the way further down the street. Before too long, he could make out the bulk of the enemy still fighting ahead, harried by his main army. He halted his elites, contemplative. "Orders, sir?" Thaka, captain of the elites, asked. "Raid those buildings," Dalinar said, pointing at a line of homes. "Let's see how well they fight while they see us rounding up their families." Thaka nodded, shouting the orders. Dalinar reached for some water. He'd need to meet up with Sadeas, and something slammed into Dalinar's shoulder. He caught only a brief sight of it, a black blur that hit with the force of a roundhouse kick. It threw him down, and pain flared up from his side. "An arrow?" he said, blinking as he found himself lying on the ground. A storming arrow sprouted from his right shoulder, one with a long, thick shaft. It had gone right through the plate. "My lord," Thaka said, kneeling, shielding Dalinar with his body. "Kalak, Bright Lord, are you—" "Who in damnation shot that?" Dalinar demanded. "Up there," Dim said, pointing at a ridge above town. "That's got to be over 300 yards, Dalinar said, shoving Thaka aside and standing. "That can't possibly—" He was watching, so he was able to jump out of the way of the next arrow, which dropped a mere foot from him, slamming against the stone ground. Dalinar stared at it, then started shouting, "Horses! Where are the storming horses?" Had the fires delayed them? No, fortunately. A small group of soldiers had guided them more carefully across the fields, but had caught up by now. They stood with the rear guard of the elites and came trotting forward as Dalinar's order was passed, bringing all 11 horses. Dalinar had to dodge another arrow as he seized the reins of Full Knight, his black gelding, and heaved himself into the saddle. He galloped back the way he'd come in, trailed by 10 of his best men. There had to be a way up that slope. There, a rocky set of switchbacks, shallow enough that he didn't mind running Full Knight up them. Dalinar was more worried that by the time he reached the top, his quarry would have escaped. He eventually burst onto the top of the ridge, and an arrow slammed into his left shoulder, going straight through the breastplate and nearly throwing him from the saddle. Damnation! He hung on somehow, clenching the reins in one hand and leaning low, watching ahead as the archer, still a distant figure, stood upon a rocky knob and launched another arrow, and another. Storms, the fellow was quick. Dalinar jerked Full Knight to one side, then the other, feeling the thrumming sense of the thrill return. It pushed back the pain as hooves made a clatter on stone, and another arrow zipped past his face, dangerously close. Ahead, the archer finally seemed to grow alarmed and leapt from his perch to flee. Dalinar charged Full Knight right over that lip a moment later, jumping the horse after the fleeing archer, who turned out to be a man in his 20s wearing rugged clothing. Dalinar had the option to run him down, but instead galloped Full Knight right past and kicked the archer in the back, sending him sprawling. Dalinar pulled up his horse, then turned it about to pass by the groaning archer, who lay in a heap amid spilled black arrows. Dalinar's elites caught up as he climbed roughly from the saddle, an arrow sprouting from each shoulder. He seized the archer, who had finally struggled to his feet and was moving, dazed, for his belt knife. Dalinar turned the fellow about, noting the blue tattoo on his cheek. The archer gasped, staring at Dalinar, who was covered in soot from the fires, his face a mask of blood from the broken nose and the cut scalp, and stuck with not one but 2 arrows. "You waited until my helm was off," Dalinar demanded. "You are an assassin. You were sent here specifically to watch for me." The man winced as Dalinar gripped him hard, but then nodded. Amazing, Dalinar said, letting go of the fellow. Show me that shot again. How far is that, Thaka? I'm right, aren't I? Over 300 yards? Almost 4, Thaka said, but with a height advantage. Still, Dalinar said, stepping up to the lip of the ridge. He looked back at the befuddled archer. Well, go grab your bow. My bow, the archer said. Are you deaf, man? Go get it. The man regarded the 10-armed elites on horseback, grim-faced and dangerous, before wisely deciding to obey. He picked up his bow and a few arrows, then stepped hesitantly over to Dalinar, giving one glance to the similar shafts that were still sprouting from him. Went right through my storming armor, Dalinar muttered, shading his eyes. To his right, the armies clashed, and the main body of elites had come up to press the flank. The rear guard had found some civilians and was shoving them out onto the street. Pick a corpse, Dalinar said, pointing to a nearby square where a skirmish had happened. Stick an arrow in one of those if you can. The archer licked his lips, still seeming confused. Finally, he took a spyglass off his belt and studied the area. That one in blue, he finally said, near the overturned cart. Dalinar squinted, then nodded. Nearby, Thaka had climbed off his horse and had slid out his sword, resting it on his shoulder. A not-so-subtle warning. The archer contemplated this, then drew his bow and launched a single black-fletched arrow. It soared true, sinking into the chosen corpse. Stormfather, Dalinar said, lowering his hand. Thaka, before today, I'd have bet you half the princedom that such a shot wasn't possible. He turned to the archer. What's your name, assassin? The man raised his chin but didn't reply. Well, either way, welcome to my elites. Somebody get this fellow a horse. What? The archer said. I tried to kill you. Yes, from a distance, which shows remarkably good judgment. I have use for someone of your skills. We're enemies. Dalinar nodded toward the town below where the beleaguered enemy army was at long last surrendering. Not anymore. Looks like we're all allies now. And there it is. That's the end, guys. So for those wondering, it's out next November. And for those who haven't read those books or any of my books, I'm not sure if that's the best introduction to Dalinar you can get. Most of them are not quite that Dalinar running around killing people-ishness. That's a word. String that together. Either way, I really appreciate you guys having me in to Google. I get to check this one off my list, and hopefully I'll get to many more in the future. Thank you very much.